nutrition science, it's not very good science. A lot of the data that we have regarding nutrition science and diets and what's good for us and what's bad for us regarding foods comes from observational studies. That data, it's not very well controlled. And that is because in order to have a quote perfect study on this, you would need to take people who are basically clones of one another, put them in two separate groups, control every single variable of their entire life, and feed only the things that you want to see if there's any difference in. That is impossible. Welcome to No Filter Doctor, where we cut through the health hype, dig into what's real, what's backed by evidence, and what works. I'm your host, Dr. AK. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me again this week. This week, we're going to talk about dieting. I can remember all kinds of crazy diets existing as far back as when I was in high school. I distinctly remember there were some of my friends who were doing nothing but eating cabbage and some of these crazy things. There's the low carb, there's the high carb, the low fat, the high protein, the paleo, the Atkins. There was a South Beach diet for a period of time that was out there. And the internet is flooded with all kinds of other dieting tips and tricks. And a lot of times, these diets are associated with purchasing a book or purchasing some kind of meal plan or something that's associated with it that does increase somebody else's bottom line. I have a conversation regarding diets with my patients all the time in the office. And so I wanted to do a podcast on it to share some of the insights that I've gained by reviewing the evidence and to help make this information a little bit less muddy. Now, there is no way that I'm going to be able to cover every single specific diet that's out there. There are way too many, but a lot of these diets share common themes when it comes to macronutrient intake. You'll see some of these patterns. And so that's what we're going to talk about, those patterns. And then you can look at the individual diets and see what pattern category does it fall into. And then hopefully that will give you some more information. There's some general information I want to discuss with you first before we get into the details of our discussion today. Now, the first thing is that nutrition science, it's not very good science. A lot of the data that we have regarding nutrition science and diets and what's good for us and what's bad for us regarding foods comes from observational studies. And so that's basically, you'll have your two groups, you'll have them on certain diets, and you're looking for different outcomes based on these diets. But that data, it's not very well controlled. And that is because in order to have a quote perfect study on this, you would need to take people who are basically clones of one another, put them in two separate groups, control every single variable of their entire life, and feed only the things that you want to see if there's any difference in. That is impossible. We are not going to clone a bunch of different people. Even if you take people who aren't cloned and it's two separate groups and you try and compare the characteristics and keep the overall characteristics similar between the two groups, no one's going to keep a bunch of human beings in isolation to control every single variable of their lives and only feed them very specific things. I don't know too many people who would agree to such a thing. Also, that would be insanely expensive and nobody's going to fund that kind of study. So that's the first thing that we need to know. Nutrition science is based on observational studies. Now, when you have enough observational studies that are communicating the same findings and demonstrating the same data, then you can start to make some assumptions based on that. But the individual observational study by itself just kind of gives you a pattern or a suggestion. It's not 100%. The next thing is that some of these diets are associated with longevity claims. There is no way to prove that these longevity claims work in humans. So if you wanted to have a diet-based longevity study in humans, it would take literally a lifetime, because how else would you know if people live longer based on their diet or not? So a lot of the longevity claims that come out about the different diets are based on preclinical studies. We're talking about mice. We're talking about different petri dish studies that look for biochemistry changes that suggest longevity. We are not talking about clinical trials in humans. You can clone mice. You can control every single variable of a mouse diet, and then you could look at the biochemistry of a mouse and say these things change or they don't change based on what the mice were fed. You cannot do that in a human and reliably come up with all of the information, because again, it would take a lifetime and the other things that I already talked about, which makes nutrition science observational instead of a perfect randomized controlled trial. Now that we've covered that, let's look into the data that we have about some of these dietary patterns. The first diet pattern I want to talk about are the vegan and vegetarian diets. Now, these are both plant-based diets. The difference is, in a vegan diet, you have no animal byproducts that are being consumed. In a vegetarian diet, you will have animal-based byproducts, things like honey, dairy, eggs. Those things are included in a vegetarian diet. And oftentimes, these diets are pushed as a heart-healthy diet. But there's a little bit of nuance that you have to know regarding these diets. In general, the vegetarian and vegan diets have a lot of processed foods in them. So a lot of times it'll be processed soy like tofu or tempeh. You have a lot of these plant-based meats that are created, like the Impossible beef and things like that. Well, those foods tend to be higher in saturated fat and higher in salt and sugar. The brand Impossible beef is entirely plant-based, and it can be a staple of a vegan or vegetarian diet, but a serving of it also has 13 grams of fat in it. 6 of those are saturated fats. Other foods that are permitted as part of a vegan or vegetarian diet are cookies, potato chips, and a lot of other prepackaged foods. So when we're talking about that vegan and vegetarian diet, it's important to identify that level of nuance, because that does not make a diet healthier. It makes it plant-based. If we stick to the whole foods form of a vegan or vegetarian diet, yes, those are overall low in saturated fats, low in processed sugars, low in salt. They are high in fiber. And there is some evidence that those diets can reverse cardiovascular disease. So the atherosclerotic buildup in the coronary arteries, there are studies that demonstrate improvement of that buildup on a whole foods vegan or vegetarian diet. And that vegetarian diet is typically low in saturated fats that would generally come from the dairy that's allowed to be included in it. The other issue with a vegan or vegetarian diet is protein intake. When we talk about proteins, there are scales that rate the quality of the protein that you get. And that quality is based on how easily are the proteins broken down and digested, how easily are the amino acids used, and is it a complete protein profile, meaning does it contain all of the essential amino acids? Plant-based proteins are typically what's called an incomplete protein, meaning one food item does not contain all of the essential amino acids. So it requires proper pairing and planning to make sure that in an entire day, you're getting all of the essential amino acids that you need to build muscle, build the proteins and enzymes, and build everything that you need for your body to function. This is not a bad thing. It just requires some planning and dedication. So whenever you hear that someone's on a vegan or vegetarian diet, the question has to be raised, well, what kind of diet are you on? Is it predominantly a whole foods type of diet, or is it one that leans on a lot of packaged and processed foods? The other question is, are you planning out your proteins properly to make sure that you're getting all of the essential amino acids that you need throughout the day? If we want to choose a vegan or vegetarian diet, it's important that we choose one that is not more detrimental than it would be if we included animal products. The next category diet I want to talk about are the low carb diets. There are so many that fall into this category: the ketogenic diet, the carnivore diet, Atkins diet, paleo diet. The common thread is generally that these are high fat, high protein, low carbohydrate diets that induce some kind of state of ketosis. Ketosis happens whenever you deprive your body of carbohydrates. What it does is it forces the body to then go to fat sources for energy, and it will use those fat sources for ATP production instead of the carbohydrates that it typically uses. One thing that cannot be disputed with these diets is people will see rapid weight loss. Now, when you compare it to other isocaloric diets, a lot of times that weight loss is actually from water loss and lean tissue. It's not necessarily fat loss, but you will eventually have fat loss as well. And there are studies that demonstrate a drop in visceral fat levels with any of these low carbohydrate diets. But then when you look at the studies that look at long-term weight loss and they compare these low carb diets to low fat diets, there's really not that much of a difference in terms of long-term weight loss. So these low carb diets in the beginning, you will see the changes. Over time, however, it all evens out and the overall weight loss is pretty similar compared to other diets. The main concern with these diets are the long-term health risks. Now, all of these low carbohydrate diets really promote animal proteins as the primary source of proteins. Well, we know that animal proteins are high in saturated fat, and we know that diets that are high in saturated fat lead to a lot of atherosclerotic disease and other metabolic risks. LDL goes up, ApoB protein particles go up. We know that, and we know that long-term risk and exposure to high levels of ApoB particles will increase the incidence of stroke and heart attack. And there were 2 studies that actually published some data on all-cause mortality and low-carb diets. One was in 2010, and another one was in 2016. And both of those studies actually found an increased risk of all-cause mortality. So not just cardiovascular disease, but all disease that increase mortality. So while there is demonstrated weight loss early on with these diets, being on them long-term may be quite problematic. There are also some studies that demonstrate long-term adherence to these diets may have some negative effects on aging biomarkers. Again, that's preclinical study. I have to say that because whether it's data we like or data we don't like, it's important to denote that these are preclinical studies. But the other long-term concern is gut microbiome. A healthy microbiome is one that is diverse. The way a diverse microbiome is achieved is through eating diverse foods. So not a low carb, high fat, but carbs, fats, proteins, all of the things. When you restrict your diet to just include a certain type of food, it can affect your microbiome and make it less diverse. The one thing that does come up over and over again with these ketogenic diets, these low carbohydrate diets, is compliance. So what happens is people will go on the low carbohydrate diet. They feel great because they have that rapid weight loss, but then they can't really maintain the diet and they end up gaining all of the weight back. One of the fastest growing trends right now in terms of diet is fasting and intermittent fasting. These diets alternate times that you can eat with times you cannot eat. And the times that you can eat might be up to 8 hours in a day, but it might be much less than that as well. What they all do is they promote a decrease overall caloric intake by controlling the time of which you can eat. So obviously, if you only have a 4-hour window that you can eat, the amount of food that you can eat in that 4 hours is going to be a lot less than the amount of food that you can eat over a 12-hour period of time. But there is some very important nuance to consider with these diets as well. So obviously, if you only have a 4-hour period of time that you can eat, but you go hit up some fast food joint and you consume 2,500 calories in that period of time, you're kind of defeating the purpose of the intermittent fasting. So the food quality that you are eating is really important. You want nutrient-dense, low-energy foods. So foods that are highly nutritious but do not have a lot of calories. The other concern is you still want enough calories that meet your body's minimal requirements to function. So some of these intermittent fasting diets, they only allow for 500 calories a day in women and 700 calories a day in men. That is not a lot of calories to meet your body's nutritional needs. So what happens is people will fast, but then they end up not getting enough protein or not enough fiber. They may not get enough of the nutrients that are required. It's really important to make sure that the body's basic metabolic needs are not compromised. There's all kinds of information regarding intermittent fasting and fasting that's thrown around all over the internet. And a lot of that information has to do with longevity. It's really important to know that most of the longevity data that comes from the intermittent fasting and fasting diets are based on rodent studies. Improved autophagy and improvement of some of the other hallmarks of aging come from this kind of study. It's not done in humans. Now, in the human studies, there is some data that is important. The intermittent fasting diets do have some improvement of metabolic disease markers. So you can have decreased visceral fat with a lot of these. Insulin resistance is huge with the intermittent fasting. There have been human studies that have been done, clinical trials, that demonstrate decreased insulin resistance with the intermittent fasting diets. But in terms of improved autophagy and some of these other hallmarks of aging, I would not put a lot of weight into that data just yet. And the reason for that is there's other studies that say, hey, this might actually increase mortality. So we just don't know yet in terms of mortality, longevity, lifespan. Does this do anything at all? It can, however, improve some of the metabolic biomarkers. The unifying thread among all of these diet patterns is decreased caloric intake. Now, when we talk about weight gain or weight loss, at the most basic level, it is a math equation. It has to do with how many calories do you burn versus how many calories do you take in. When you take in more calories than those that your body burns, you gain weight. When you do the opposite, you lose weight. And when you are equal, you maintain weight. That is basic math. Now, that doesn't define all of the other variables and factors that go into obesity or weight gain and some of the other issues that people deal with in real life, right? It's more complicated than third grade math. But that is basically what these diets are using to induce weight loss. It is caloric restriction. But the goal here is not to be on some fad diet for short-term caloric restriction. Because no matter what diet you look at, if it's hard to maintain, people will regain the weight. It comes down to modifications that are made that can be maintained. A much more sustainable approach to weight loss and health involves understanding energy needs, understanding nutrient requirements, eating mindfully, and focusing on the whole meal rather than these drastic leaps for fad diets. Well-balanced, whole food-based diets that are high in lean proteins, whole grains, lots of fiber, lots of fruits and veggies, those are the ones that tend to come out on top when we talk about improved health over a long period of time. Mediterranean diet is very well studied. It is a very healthy diet based on the collection of all of the observational data that we have. The DASH diet is very much like the Mediterranean diet, but it focuses a little bit more on sodium intake. That's been well studied in people with high blood pressure, and it can greatly improve blood pressure. A flexitarian diet is one where, again, it's whole food based and it's not just plant based or just one of these low carbohydrate, mainly animal based diets. It flexes back and forth, so you get that variety that your microbiome needs in order to be diverse. All of the different diets that are out there are confusing. There's so many different kinds. The U.S. News and World Report used to publish a list every year where they would rank the different diets in terms of long-term health. They don't do that anymore. So 2025 was the last year that the U.S. News and World Report would put out their rankings of the healthiest diets that are available. Now they put out a ranking of health trends. So you can't really use that anymore to help you with the diet. There's so many influencers telling us what we should and shouldn't eat. I think rather than jump on a particular diet, we should stick to maybe a few general rules. One general rule is stick to the items that are along the periphery of the grocery store. Those aisles that are in the middle, a lot of those are prepackaged foods. They're high in fat, they're high in sodium, there's a lot of added processed sugars. Now, the exception to that rule are things like whole grains and beans, things like brown rice, farro, barley, lentils, black beans. You're going to find those items in those central aisles. And I don't want to push anyone away from all prepackaged foods. I think reading a nutrition label is really important. Things that are high in fiber, low in fat, high in protein, those are wins. So those are great foods. But most of the other foods that are contained within the central aisles of the grocery store can be eliminated. We do not need them, and a lot of them are not healthy. The next general rule would be to follow the My Plate pattern for portion control of how we eat our foods. If you look it up, it'll demonstrate that half the plate is going to be fruits and vegetables. 1/4 of the plate is a normal serving size of a lean protein, and then the other 1/4 of the plate is a serving size of whole grains. Oftentimes, people will pile all this food on their plate like Mount Kilimanjaro, like gobble it all up and then lay back with a distended belly and are super uncomfortable, falling asleep. Yeah, if you can control your portions, you are going to calorie restrict without compromising any nutritional needs. So that's rule number 2. Number 3 is our food intake should be aligned with our health goals and not compromise any medical conditions. For example, if someone has really bad cardiovascular disease, going on a low carbohydrate diet is a very bad idea. You are going to worsen that atherosclerotic burden. Sure, you might lose weight, but your coronary arteries are not going to be happy. I've shared before that I can't do the fasting. I don't eat enough throughout the day. I am so busy. I'm like zipping around all the time that I will accidentally forget to eat. If I put an even bigger restriction on that in terms of what times I allow myself to eat, there is zero chance that I'm going to get enough calories that I need throughout the day. And I absolutely will not get the amount of protein that I need in order to meet that goal of putting on muscle mass. So we have to align how we want to eat with our health goals without compromising other health issues. And then the last general rule, but definitely not the least, is however we choose to eat, it has to be something that is sustainable. A lot of times people go on these crash diets, they lose a bunch of weight, they do it right away, but none of these things are sustainable. And once they stop dieting, all the weight comes back. So if we eat with a pattern that has foods, whether you want to time it, whatever it is that you want to do, as long as it's something that is sustainable, that is going to give you the best overall health, weight loss, whatever your goal is over time, as opposed to doing anything in a crashed setting. So independent of the diet that's out there, independent of what wellness influencers are telling us, I think those 4 general rules really are ones that if we follow, we will meet our nutritional goals and our body composition goals that we want to set for ourselves without compromising other aspects of our health. The diet industry is big business. They're going to make a lot of bold claims because people want your money. There was a paper that looked at all of the claims, the health claims that were made by that South Beach diet, and they found that 67% of the claims were not supported by any peer-reviewed literature. One of the ways that the diet industry succeeds is through your failure. You buy into it, you spend all this money, you do these things that they're telling you to do that are not sustainable. You have this short-term goal that you've achieved, but then you can't maintain it long term. And guess what? You go spend some more money. The key here is not a fad diet. The key here is overall small changes that will help you get healthy long term. Now, I know I did not get into all of the nitty gritties of all of these individual diets. So if there are certain diets that I left out or diet patterns that you're concerned about that I left out, let me know and I will try and cover that topic in the future. And as always, thank you so much for joining me this week. I will talk to you next week. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's No Filter Doctor. If you enjoyed the content, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also go to www.thewholehumanhealthandwellbeing.com and sign up for the weekly newsletter where you will get a link to the blog, that week's podcast, and a health tip of the week sent directly to you. It's important to know that while I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it's not intended as medical advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The information discussed should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should it replace individualized medical care. If you have questions or concerns about your health, please contact your own healthcare provider. Any decisions to delay or forego a medical evaluation or treatment based on the information discussed in this podcast are made so at your own risk. My only financial disclosure is my medical practice, The Whole Human Health and Wellbeing. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week.